Millerville, Tennessee, October 15, 1978. The smell of burning leaves drifted through the crisp autumn air as Sarah Beth Coleman stepped out of Hendrick's General Store, clutching a brown paper bag containing milk, bread, and her mother's favorite peppermint tea. At 19, Sarah Beth was known throughout Millerville for her infectious laugh and her habit of humming gospel hymns while she walked. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street, where only 3 buildings stood between the store and the old Methodist church. Sarah Beth had promised her mother she'd be home before dark to help prepare Sunday dinner for the visiting preacher. It was a 15-minute walk along Possum Creek Road to the Coleman farm, a route she'd traveled thousands of times since childhood. The gravel crunched beneath her worn leather boots as she passed the old Miller place, where Mrs. Miller always waved from her kitchen window. Today, the window remained dark. At 4:30 p.m., according to store owner Jim Hendricks, Sarah Beth had been in good spirits, chatting about the upcoming church harvest festival and asking if he'd received any letters for her family. She'd been expecting news from her older brother stationed in Germany. Jim remembered her yellow cardigan and the way she'd carefully counted out exact change from her small purse, leaving a penny tip for good luck. The Coleman farm sat nestled in a valley where the creek curved sharply eastward, surrounded by rolling hills thick with oak and maple trees. Her father, Thomas Coleman, had been repairing fence posts since dawn, working his way closer to the main road as the day progressed. Her mother, Margaret, had spent the afternoon preparing her famous cornbread and green beans, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen window that faced the direction Sarah Beth would return. By 6 p.m., when the dinner bells of neighboring farms began ringing across the valley, Margaret felt the first stirring of unease. Sarah Beth was never late for Sunday preparations. By 6:30, Thomas had walked halfway down Possum Creek Road, calling her name into the growing dusk. By 7 p.m., when full darkness settled over Millerville like a heavy quilt, the Colemans knew something was terribly wrong. The brown paper bag was found the next morning by 12-year-old Billy Patterson, who'd been walking his family's dog along the creek. The milk had spoiled in the Tennessee heat, but the bread remained untouched, and the peppermint tea boxes were still perfectly stacked inside. The bag lay crumpled among the cattails, roughly 50 yards from where Possum Creek Road crossed the old wooden bridge. But Sarah Beth Coleman had vanished completely, as if she'd simply decided to stop existing on that golden October afternoon in 1978. The Millerville Volunteer Fire Department organized the first search party before dawn on October 17th. 37 men and women combed through the dense woods surrounding Possum Creek, their voices echoing across the valley as they called Sarah Beth's name until their throats grew raw. Sheriff Roy Blanchard brought in tracking dogs from Nashville, but the scent trail ended abruptly at the creek's edge, where the water ran deep and fast from recent autumn rains. Margaret Coleman, aged 10 years in 10 days. Neighbors later remembered how she'd stand at her kitchen window for hours, staring down the empty road, her hands pressed flat against the glass. She refused to remove Sarah Beth's place setting from the dinner table, insisting her daughter might return hungry. Thomas threw himself into farm work with desperate intensity, clearing brush and mending fences that didn't need repair, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering into dark possibilities. The local newspaper, the Millerville Gazette, ran Sarah Beth's photograph on the front page for 3 consecutive weeks. The image showed a young woman with bright eyes and dark hair, pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same yellow cardigan she'd disappeared in. Editor Frank Morrison received dozens of tips. Sarah Beth had been seen boarding a Greyhound bus in Nashville, hitchhiking toward Memphis, working at a diner in Knoxville. Every lead evaporated under investigation. As winter settled over Tennessee, the search efforts dwindled. The creek froze solid in January, allowing searchers to examine the stream bed more thoroughly, but they found nothing except old farm equipment and deer bones. By spring of 1979, most people in Millerville had developed their own theories about what happened to Sarah Beth Coleman. Some whispered about a secret boyfriend who'd convinced her to run away. Others suggested she'd fallen into the creek and been swept downstream toward the Tennessee River. The cruelest theory, spoken only in hushed conversations at church socials, was that Sarah Beth had been taken by someone she trusted, someone who knew her routine well enough to intercept her on that familiar walk home. But in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where front doors remained unlocked and children played outside until midnight during summer, such a possibility seemed unthinkable. Years passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret Coleman developed arthritis in her hands from gripping the kitchen windowsill too tightly during her daily vigils. Thomas's hair turned completely white by his 50th birthday. They never moved from the farm, never changed Sarah Beth's bedroom, never stopped hoping she might return with an explanation that would make sense of their suffering. The community's memory of Sarah Beth Coleman became something sacred and untouchable, preserved in the Methodist Church's prayer requests and in the annual scholarship fund established in her name. But as the 1980s turned into the 1990s and the 1990s became the new millennium, Millerville gradually accepted that some mysteries would never be solved. June 18, 2024. The demolition of Hendricks. General Store had been postponed 3 times due to rain, but finally, on a sweltering Tuesday morning that promised temperatures above 90 degrees, the excavator arrived in Millerville. Jim Hendricks had died the previous winter at age 89, and his children had decided to sell the property to a developer planning to build a small medical clinic. Construction foreman Dave Martinez had been working demolition jobs across Tennessee for 23 years, but he'd never encountered a building quite like Hendricks' General Store. The structure dated back to 1923, built with hand-hewn timber and fieldstone foundation that seemed determined to resist modern machinery. When the excavator finally broke through the wooden floorboards near the back of the store, Martinez noticed something unusual about the floor joists. Wedged between 2 massive support beams, wrapped in what appeared to be an old feed sack, was a small leather purse. The leather had darkened with age and moisture, but the brass clasp still gleamed faintly in the morning sunlight, streaming through the demolished roof. Martinez carefully extracted the purse and brushed away decades of accumulated dust and debris. Inside, he found $16 in bills that looked strangely crisp despite their age, a Tennessee driver's license issued to Sarah Beth Coleman with an address on Possum Creek Road, and a small silver locket containing a photograph of a young couple standing in front of a Methodist church. The license showed an expiration date of October 1980, and the photograph in the locket had been carefully trimmed to fit the oval frame. Martinez had lived in nearby Cookeville his entire life and remembered the Coleman case from his childhood. His own mother had participated in those early search parties, returning home exhausted and heartbroken after days of fruitless searching. He immediately called Sheriff Rebecca Torres, who had taken over the department when Roy Blanchard retired in 2003. The discovery sent shockwaves through Millerville's aging population. Margaret Coleman had passed away in 2009, and Thomas followed her in 2015, both having died without ever learning what happened to their daughter. But Sarah Beth's cousins still lived in the area, and her childhood friends remembered every detail of that October afternoon 46 years ago. The question that haunted everyone was simple and terrible. How had Sarah Beth's purse ended up hidden beneath the floorboards of the very store where she'd made her last purchase? The location suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the building's layout, someone who understood that the space between those particular floor joists would remain undisturbed for decades. Sheriff Torres ordered a complete forensic examination of the Site E, and crime scene technicians spent 4 days carefully sifting through debris that had accumulated beneath the store since 1978. They found nothing else connected to Sarah Beth Coleman, but the purse itself told a story that would soon unravel a secret Millerville had been living with for nearly half a century. The forensic analysis of Sarah Beth's purse revealed partial fingerprints on the brass clasp that had survived 46 years of humidity and decay. When Sheriff Torres ran those prints through the state database, she got a match that made her immediately call the district attorney's office. James Jimmy Hendricks, age 73, Jim Hendricks, younger son who had worked at the General Store throughout the 1970s. Jimmy Hendricks had left Millerville in 1980, moving to Memphis where he'd worked as a mechanic until his retirement. He'd returned to town only for his father's funeral, staying just long enough to handle estate matters before disappearing again. When sheriff's deputies arrested him at his apartment in Cordova, Tennessee on July 2, 2024, Jimmy's first words were not denial or confusion, but rather a quiet statement that stunned the officers. "I've been waiting for this day for 46 years. The confession came in fragments over 3 separate interviews, each revelation more heartbreaking than the last. Jimmy had been 27 in 1978, unmarried and still living in his father's house behind the General Store. He'd developed feelings for Sarah Beth Coleman that she didn't reciprocate, feelings that had grown into an obsession that consumed his thoughts and distorted his judgment. On October 15th, 1978, after Sarah Beth left the store with her groceries, Jimmy had followed her along Possum Creek Road. He'd convinced himself that if he could just talk to her alone, away from the store and the watchful eyes of the community, he could make her understand how much he cared for her. When he approached her near the creek bridge, Sarah Beth had become frightened by his intensity and tried to run. The struggle was brief but tragic. Jimmy insisted he'd never intended to hurt her, that he'd only wanted to prevent her from leaving. But when Sarah Beth fell and struck her head on the bridge's wooden railing, she'd lost consciousness immediately. Panicked and realizing the gravity of what had happened, Jimmy had carried her back to the store through the woods, entering through the rear door after dark. Sarah Beth had died sometime during the night, never regaining consciousness. Jimmy spent the following day in a state of shock, going through the motions of normal life while his father worked in the front of the store, completely unaware that his son had hidden a body in the basement. That evening, under cover of darkness, Jimmy had buried Sarah Beth in a remote section of the Hendricks property, in a grove of pine trees that had since been clear-cut for development. The purse had been forgotten during those desperate hours, dropped near the basement stairs. Jimmy had discovered it days later, and, in a moment of panic, had hidden it beneath the store's floorboards. He'd lived with the secret for 46 years, never marrying, never forming close relationships, carrying the weight of what he'd done like a stone in his chest. The confession led investigators to the original burial site, where forensic anthropologists recovered Sarah Beth's remains in August 2024. She was finally laid to rest beside her parents in Millerville Methodist Cemetery, while Jimi Hendrix awaited trial for involuntary manslaughter and concealment of a death. The case's resolution brought a measure of peace to Sarah Beth's surviving family members and to the community that had never forgotten her. But it also raised disturbing questions about how well we truly know the people around us, and how long secrets can remain buried in small towns where everyone believes they know everyone else's story. On October 15, 2024, exactly 46 years after Sarah Beth Coleman's disappearance, the people of Millerville gathered at her gravestone for a memorial service that was equal parts celebration and mourning. Celebration for finally knowing the truth, and mourning for all the years of uncertainty that could never be reclaimed. Hamilton County Courthouse, Chattanooga, Tennessee, February 2025. The courthouse steps were slick with morning frost as dozens of Millerville residents made the 2-hour drive to witness Jimi Hendrix face justice. Among them sat elderly faces that had aged decades since 1978, carrying memories of search parties, sleepless nights, and a young woman's laughter that had been silenced too soon. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Patricia Williams, had prepared a case that would force an entire community to confront how well they had truly known their neighbors. Jimi Hendrix appeared frail in his orange jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the robust young man who had once helped customers at his father's store. His court-appointed attorney, Michael Chen, had negotiated a plea agreement, but the judge insisted on a full hearing to provide closure for the family and community. The gallery filled with Sarah Beth's cousins, childhood friends, and neighbors who had spent decades wondering what had happened on that October afternoon. The most powerful testimony came from Betty Morrison, now 78 DOS, who had been Sarah Beth's closest friend in 1978. She described the last conversation they'd had at church that Sunday morning, how Sarah Beth had been excited about a letter she was expecting from her brother in Germany, how she'd planned to enter her apple pie in the Harvest Festival contest. Betty's voice cracked as she recalled the search parties, the false hopes, and the gradual acceptance that her friend was never coming home. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic anthropologist who had recovered Sarah Beth's remains, presented evidence that supported Jimmy's confession. The location of the bones, the absence of trauma beyond the head injury, and the preservation of certain personal items all corroborated his account. She spoke with clinical precision about cause of death, but her voice softened when describing how carefully Sarah Beth had been buried, with her hands folded across her chest in a position that suggested remorse rather than malice. Perhaps the most difficult moment came when Judge Robert Harrison read excerpts from Jimmy's written confession, which had been expanded during months of interviews with psychologists. Jimmy described years of watching Sarah Beth from afar, convincing himself that her polite smiles meant something more, building elaborate fantasies about a relationship that existed only in his mind. He wrote about the immediate regret that followed her death, the nausea that accompanied every meal for months afterward, and the relief he felt when leaving Millerville in 1980. The psychological evaluation revealed a man who had lived in self-imposed isolation for 46 years, unable to form meaningful relationships while carrying the weight of his secret. Dr. Sarah Reynolds, who had conducted extensive interviews with Jimmy, testified that he showed genuine remorse and had likely suffered from what would now be diagnosed as severe depression and anxiety disorders stemming from his actions. Jimmy's brief statement to the court was barely audible, requiring him to repeat his words twice. He apologized to the Coleman family, to the community of Millerville, and to Sarah Beth's memory. He asked for no mercy, stating that he had already received more than he deserved by living free while others suffered. His voice broke completely when he mentioned Thomas and Margaret Coleman, expressing devastation that they had died without knowing what happened to their daughter. Judge Harrison sentenced Jimi Hendrix to 12 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter and concealment of death, taking into account his age, his cooperation with authorities, and the unique circumstances of the case. The sentence was less than prosecutors had sought, but Sarah Beth's cousin, David Coleman, stood to address the court and expressed the family's acceptance of the outcome. He stated that no punishment could bring Sarah Beth back, but finally knowing the truth allowed them to grieve properly and honor her memory. The trial's conclusion sparked conversations throughout Tennessee about missing persons cases, the importance of mental health resources in rural communities, and the ways that secrets can poison small towns for generations. Sheriff Rebecca Torres announced the formation of a cold case unit dedicated to reviewing unsolved disappearances dating back to the 1960s, inspired by the resolution of Sarah Beth's case. Local newspapers across the region covered the story extensively, with many drawing parallels to their own unsolved cases. The Nashville Scene published a feature article titled "The Secrets We Keep: How One Tennessee Town Lived with a Killer for 46 Years, which sparked discussions about the nature of evil in everyday life and the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. Millerville Methodist Cemetery, October 15, 2025. The oak trees surrounding Sarah Beth Coleman's grave had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, creating a canopy of autumn colors that reminded visitors of the season when she disappeared 47 years earlier. Her headstone, carved from Tennessee marble, bore a simple inscription: Sarah Beth Coleman, 1959 to 1978. Beloved daughter and friend, finally home. The Sarah Beth Coleman Foundation, established by her surviving family members, had awarded its first scholarship that spring to a young woman from Millerville, studying forensic science at the University of Tennessee. The recipient, Emma Rodriguez, planned to specialize in cold case investigations, inspired by Sarah Beth's story, and determined to help other families find answers to their own mysteries. Sheriff Rebecca Torres visited the grave every few months, always bringing fresh flowers and spending a few minutes in quiet reflection. The cold case unit she had established in Sarah Beth's honor had already reopened investigations into 6 unsolved disappearances across rural Tennessee, using modern forensic techniques and renewed community cooperation to search for answers that had eluded previous generations. Jimi Hendrix, now serving his sentence at the Tennessee Prison for Women and Aging Offenders in Nashville, had requested permission to write a letter of apology to be read at Sarah Beth's memorial service. The family declined, but his attorney reported that Jimmy spent his time tutoring other inmates in reading and writing, quietly trying to find some small way to contribute positively to the world he had damaged. The general store site had been transformed into the Millerville Community Health Center, with a small memorial garden planted where the building's back door once stood. Native Tennessee wildflowers bloomed there each spring and summer, tended by volunteers who remembered Sarah Beth's love of gardening and her gentle way with all living things. Perhaps the most lasting change in Millerville was harder to quantify but no less real. Conversations became more honest, relationships more genuine, and the community more willing to acknowledge that darkness could exist anywhere, even in the most peaceful places. Parents talked more openly with their children about safety and trust. Neighbors checked on each other more frequently. The Methodist Church began offering grief counseling and mental health resources, recognizing that healing required more than prayer alone. Dave Martinez, the construction foreman who had discovered Sarah Beth's purse, kept a photograph of her on his truck's dashboard. He often spoke to students at local high schools about the importance of speaking up when something doesn't feel right, using Sarah Beth's story as a reminder that silence can sometimes be more dangerous than action. On that October anniversary in 2025, as golden leaves drifted down around the cemetery like confetti celebrating a life finally honored properly, the people of Millerville gathered not just to remember Sarah Beth Coleman, but to reflect on the lessons her story had taught them about truth, justice, and the complexity of human nature. The wind carried the sound of distant church bells across the valley, and for a moment, those who had known her could almost hear her humming along, finally at peace after 47 years of waiting for the truth to set everyone free.